we're lucky to have Kevin Padian speak. And Catherine prepared this little blurb of a bio, which I'm just going to read because it's, well, you'll see why. So, Kevin Padian received his PhD from Yale University in 1980 and has been IB professor and curator of paleontology at UCMP ever since. The scope of his work falls into 4 general areas, which I'm sure many of us know about: the origin of major evolutionary adaptations, particularly flight, the beginnings of the age of dinosaurs, the systematics, functional morphology, and flight of pterosaurs, and the histology and constructional morphology of extinct reptile bones. So if you don't know about Kevin's work, you should. So go to his website and you can see all his papers there. But she also says, which I didn't know, that he's a big fan of country singer Marty Stewart. I confess I don't even know who he is. And the Oakland Athletics. I know who they are. So welcome and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Mike. We have a chair down here next to Jimmy. Here's another chair here. If you want to sit there, I think we can probably roll another one over there if you want. Will that work? Chairs?
Yeah, okay, sure. That's great.
So you guys don't have to, if you're crowding in the doorways.
If there's somebody who wants to come up the middle.
Jim doesn't bite much.
Just a little.
That's right. Come on. It's okay, good. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. What a great place, what a great group of people. Just seeing everybody here. What a strong, amazing institution. Man, this place rocks, doesn't it? I mean, Michael can't say because he's the director, but come on, this place rocks. It rocks, you guys are amazing. I want to talk to you about sexual selection. I've got a lot of stuff on. I might not get to the whole extinct part, but I want to just kind of give you a feel for that. And it's I'm not going to tell you what to think about sexual selection. I'm not going to tell you I'm right or other people. I want to tell you what people think, what they have thought, what Darwin meant by sexual selection when he invented it, why he invented it, why he wrote a book called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which does not seem to follow for most people. And I want to do this in order to put an historical perspective on a topic that, when you read the literature, it sometimes gets pretty confusing. And I want to explain why it might be confusing. Feel free to argue with me. If you walk out of here and I haven't convinced you of anything, I don't care. I just want to show you some of the background on this, because I got into this because I was looking at people writing about sexual selection in extinct animals, and I didn't understand what they were talking about. I didn't understand how they thought they could say that. So this is a dinosaur. Everybody knows that, right? Okay, we're good with that. And can you do this? I don't know if this is going to work. Well, shoot. If this works, maybe you put it right there, but then, well, I can do this here. Okay, that's a dinosaur too. And when you saw the weird structures on that peacock, sexual selection comes to mind. We'll get back to that. But here, when you see these bizarre structures on these dinosaurs, a lot of paleontologists have said, oh, that must be for sexual selection too. And I thought, wait. How do they know this? What are we doing with this, and how do we test these ideas? Can we even test these ideas in old dead critters? Well, to begin with then, let's talk about some of the contrasts. Here's the peacock, beautiful, beautiful colors on the body and all that. Here's the peahen, I think a gorgeous bird, but very different without, obviously, the tail and the chicks, which are really cute. Obviously, a great deal of sexual difference, dimorphism, even between the males and females. That's really obvious. But not all birds are like this. Here are a couple of seagulls. You're not seeing very much difference between the male and the female. Here are a couple of bagels. They're in mating position. Very widely said. But so some dinosaurs have this and some dinosaurs don't. And so why do they have it? How often has it evolved? What do we know about these things? So here are the points of lecture. Darwin invented sexual selection for a very cool and complex reason, and he requires sexual dimorphism in his definition. Some recent workers don't think this because they equate all selection outcomes with just how many offspring you leave, and I'm going to tell you why this is. And so now we conflate sexual selection with all of these other things that are different from what Darwin actually conceived. I'm going to argue that he felt the difference was useful, and I think we should think about that. I think that we have to look at social interactions as hierarchical as opposed to how general they are down to the specific, and I'm going to put sexual selection in a surprising place for you. And I think all this research is great. I mean, I'd love to look at it, but a lot of it doesn't really concern what Darwin would have called sexual selection. But it's really cool. And actually, we're paleontologists are kind of hopelessly confused most of the time anyway. At least I am. But this is a problem, as you'll see, when we try to apply definitions of sexual selection to extinct things that are outside phylogenetic brackets that are comfortable for us. So let's first begin by talking about fitness. Darwin didn't use the term fitness much, but he did use the term fit, and he knew what he meant by it. And when early workers in the 1900s reified and resuscitated Darwin's ideas about selection and so forth, fitness was important for them. So you can read this quote, and you can see that by fitness, Darwin meant being well adapted to your environment, or having characteristics that gave you advantages over other individuals in your species for surviving, because he understood the struggle for survival. But if you look at, and Doug Fatuma's book we're saying is a great, great evolution book, and his definition is like the standard definition in the field now. Fitness has been reduced to simply how many offspring you leave. Now, that's a little bit strange. And there's an elision there. There's a jump from one place to the other. We have to think about how we got there historically, how we did it. Like, my daughter's going to have a kid next week, okay? People don't go up to her and say, wow, you're going to become more fit. If she wants to become more fit, she'll go to the gym. Okay? So why do we call producing a lot of offspring fitness? This is an important thing to understand historically, because this is the logic that you all know about why natural selection should work. And it has to do with differential preservation of better characteristics. So they will eventually become more common in the species, but that doesn't mean that you have greater fecundity and leave more offspring, so that your offspring survive better. So instead what we have today is we have most offspring are the most fit. And so we don't know whether this means quantity over quality, but sometimes the quality part of it is not actually assessed. And, well, they're only just, all these modifications of different fitness are only reproductive measures. What I'm bringing up is nothing new. Waddington, who was like the original Evo-Devo guy in the 1950s, during a conference at the Wistar Institute on mathematical challenges to the neo-Darwinian synthesis of evolution, made a comment afterwards. It was a long comment. It's something everybody should read, and if you give it, give you a copy of it. But he was puzzled about this whole thing that seemed to make natural selection a tautology. The mathematicians were arguing, isn't natural selection a tautology? Because you produce more offspring, you're more fit. Who's more fit? Well, the ones who produce more offspring. Well, so that's circular reasoning. Creationists have been honest about that for decades, and they're correct. We don't like to admit that, but they're correct. We should be more careful with our language and what we mean. So if you don't specify the very important mechanism of the ones who are producing or more offspring or surviving are the ones who actually are better fit for their environment, then fitness becomes an adaptive concept that results in differential preservation of offspring. Okay, and so that's where the whole elision came place. In the early decades of the 1900s, when people were starting to do mathematical models and to show that selection actually could make a difference, because in the end of the 1800s they didn't think so. When they were starting to do this work, they weren't able to quantify how much better adapted you were than your friend over here. So they said, well, eventually you're going to leave more offspring in the next generation. So we just made that little W bar. That's number of offspring. And so that's how it got elided into what we teach today. And as Waddington said, everyone has it smuggled in the back of his mind that these are the most fit, but we don't always say that. So sometimes these words can become a little bit insidious because now fitness is all about the number of offspring you produce. Why is that a problem? Because it's easy to show mathematically that if your fecundity ratio is this, but your adaptiveness ratio is this, under soft selection, this phenotype might leave more offspring, but under harder selection, it would be the reverse. So it's not just a question of mathematical modeling or reproductive outcome. There has to be the concept of fitness put in there if we're going to make sense of what Darwin said and what we really do as evolutionary biologists anyway. So if we turn to sexual selection, we have the question of where does this whole idea come from? Darwin introduces it in The Origin of Species in the first 100 pages of the book. He hasn't got time to say a lot about it, but he wants you to know that there's something going on here when you've got structures that differ between the males and females in these various things. They have been mainly caused by sexual selection. That is, that males have had a slight advantage in their weapons, means of defense, or charm. So this is all about attracting mates and repelling rivals for mates by use of these features that the males have and the females don't. And sometimes the sexes are reversed, but that's, that's okay. And that's what is being transmitted to the male offspring. So they don't understand chromosomes, they don't know sex linkage, but they know that there's a consistency here, and we'll get back to that later. So what happens here in the course of things is that Steve Arnold, in the process of trying to determine, in a really cool paper, whether sexual selection can be applied to plants, realizes that he can't do it the way Darwin was talking about doing it, because they don't have the attraction and the repelling rivals and things like that. But he thinks that he can do it if he brings it down to differences in mating success. Because as you've just seen, fitness has been reduced to mating output. And if the mating success can be done, then maybe you can figure this out. In a way, he's picking up this cue from a great paper by Mary Jane West Eberhard, talking about social selection, sexual selection, and the interactions of these things. And she was beginning to reduce these concepts in sexual selection also to number of offspring, much in the same way that natural selection had done this, had that happened to it before. So we get, and I know you've read these by now, you're getting a change or a deterioration from where Darwin's whole kind of morphological behavioral concept is moving out, and now it's just a question of the number of offspring. And it's even called a kind of natural selection, which Doug Fatuma also thinks, and many of you in this room may also think it is too. I'm going to show you why Darwin didn't think it is, and why we might want to understand this. I know it's right, but see, he can't be wrong because first of all, he defined the concept, and he wrote like a 2-volume, like 900-page book about it, where he went through everything in the animal kingdom, which I'm going to show you, like what he's doing. And the examples are so copious, and his definition is so consistent throughout. When you actually read through his whole book, but it's really pretty cool. And he actually invented it to account for different features natural selection couldn't. When he saw the peacock's tail, he said, "It makes me sick to my stomach." That's a very famous line. But it didn't make him sick to his stomach because he didn't think it could evolve. He couldn't explain it by natural selection. And he was worried that when he put his big baby out there, the natural selection, that people could point to features like the peacock's tail and go, "Wait a second, you're telling me this increases the animal's ability to survive?" And Darwin knew that this and dozens of other examples throughout the animal kingdom were not making its bearers better at surviving. They're enabling one sex to attract mates or repel rivals for mates, and that's what he was trying to do. So sexual selection cannot be a type of natural selection because they actually can work in opposition, as we'll see, and it requires sexual dimorphism to do it. And I'm going to say not just sexual differences because he made a big point of this. This is, I know, a longish quote, and the white bold italicized passage are things I'd like you to consider most. What he's doing is he's saying this is not from being better fitted to survive in the struggle, but from having gained an advantage over other males with respect to reproducing, succeeding in pairing with the females. It was the importance of this distinction which led me to see this form of selection as sexual selection. He doesn't say this form of natural selection. He said this form of selection, and he saw it was really quite different. So it depends on the dimorphism. And he says it again and again. When he goes, has anyone ever read through the Descent of Man and Selection, Relation, and Sex, like the whole thing? This is like an amazing book. You would think, he starts off by talking about certain kinds of sexual differences and things like that, and behaviors and reproductive, and then he stops. And then there's 500 pages of examples. And he goes through the entire animal kingdom. Amazingly. And consistently as he goes through example after example, there's this vermes, which, knows they're just like wormy things. He describes them a lot, and this is a typical passage, but as the sexes do not differ, we're but of little concern with them. It's always a question of sexual dimorphism in every example. And you can go through this, as I did. I've counted, I went through and counted every example that he makes. Sometimes it's about the species, sometimes of a much larger group. But when you do this, I found 300 examples on 500 pages, and every one of them, sexual dimorphism. Not a single one. Some he's not sure about, and that's the other thing. He's perfectly willing to acknowledge that sometimes traits evolve by natural selection, sometimes by sexual selection. Sometimes you just don't know, and they can use them for both. So we don't really have to, like reindeer horns. Yes, we know they're sexual, and the females don't have them, but they can use them for other things. They can fight with them. For example, they can fight off wolves. What do the females do? They use their hooves. So do the males, especially when they shed them. So there's lots of things to do here. And examples of sexual dimorphism are easy to pick out. You understand what these are. The males often have a structure or a behavior that the females don't. Sexual differences can be a little bit different. You might say, wait a second, those frogs are dimorphic. Well, they are. They're dimorphic in size, that's true. But the size is not being used to attract mates or repel rivals. And that's where Darwin's definition of sexual selection would differentiate for us between these processes. Here, for example, in Daphnia, the male is small, the female is large. Why? Well, the females can actually use their bodies to hold more eggs. The male doesn't have to have such a big body. And we can find many examples of that in the animal kingdom. We don't see much difference between male and female elephants, except in size. Crocodiles, same thing. These have size. They're sometimes vastly different size, but they do use their size as a way of fighting off other males and of attracting. So you can use size alone to do it, but you have to show this. You can't just say that because there's a difference, it's sexual selection. Shaping, we're not sure. With these guys, we don't really know for sure what's going on. But what's interesting is as you move up toward living humans, did I say up toward? I didn't mean that. Along the hominid line, the sexual dimorphism decreases steadily. Other apes, other primates, generally have much higher sexual dimorphism. Even bonobos, which are supposed to be male, they do. So these things are always in the mix. It's not always clear cut, but again, the whole thing is to think about the dimorphism and using those features to attract mates or repel rivals and showing all these things. So far, this is what we get out of a reading of Darwin and why he invented this concept and why he was so finicky about it. He wanted to explain sexual dimorphism. He wanted to explain odd, bizarre characteristics that one sex has that the other one doesn't, that aren't particularly good for your own adapted adaptive condition. So one reason why sexual selection can't be kind of a kind of natural selection is that the forces are often in opposition. And I think all of you probably know Mike Ryan's work on the Tangara frogs, right? Yes? Yeah. Okay, good. I mean, it's a very famous example. For those who don't, he's got the male frog here makes a long call with little chucks at the end, which the females like. But the longer your call is and the showier it is, the more the bat predators can find you. So here's you could be really sexy but dead. And so that's like the James Dean approach. And this is, so here's a case where, your sexiness is in direct opposition to your survivability. and there are many examples of this in the animal kingdom, but it's one reason why we have to keep these concepts straight. Although we can find features in which that have both a natural selection and a sexual selection value, I think. So they're both forms of selection. Why is it important to try to keep definitions straight? It's true that we do learn a lot more about biology and concepts through time, but it doesn't mean that the original definitions then should be changed as a result. Sometimes the original concepts were based on mistakes, not in this case. So if I asked you what a chair is, how would you define a chair? What would you tell me?
Based on use, sitting on.
You can start. So Phil says anything you're sitting on. Okay, it's good. So there's a chair. So is that a chair? Is that a chair? No. Okay, is that a chair? You can sit on it unless it's too hot. Okay, is that a chair? No. All right. So you know why if you want to make a definition of something that distinguishes these objects from each other, you have to give them their defining features, and that if anything becomes a chair, then your language deteriorates. And sometimes the problems with that is it creates confusion. It loses sight of why the original concept was developed in the first place. And sometimes it has problems because then we start thinking things are what they weren't originally supposed to be. And so our clarity and our communication suffer as a result. What I like to do is go through the literature and look at abstracts and papers that regard sexual selection. I think it's I just think it's really interesting, really fascinating work. But this is just what I just didn't want to bore you. I got example after example after example. But what I find in an example like this is that I'm not seeing Darwin's idea of sexual selection in that I'm not seeing sexual dimorphism being used, some dimorphic character being used to attract mates or repel rivals for mates. In fact, a lot of times people are simply talking about mate choice or about mate competition, which are concepts that are allied to sexual selection. But what I'm going to show you, I hope, is that there is a hierarchical distinction between them, because not all mate choice is sexual selection, is about sexual selection. So, by the way, this is a blue paper, and there's a lot of ones like that. Doug, in his book, lists all of these things that he says are mechanisms of sexual selection. I would comment that, in Darwin's view, many of them would not be, unless you can demonstrate that you've got a dimorphic feature or behavior that is being used to attract mates or repel rivals for mates. You guys all, you hear, you've read about all these, you know examples of them, I have to go through it. But it's interesting how broad the concept of sexual selection has become in recent years. A lot of people talk about mutual sexual selection. This is the crest of auklet, the poster child for mutual sexual selection. And the studies on this animal are really cool. It's a very unusual bird and a very interesting bird. It does not have much in the way of sexual dimorphism. There's some differences, but overall, those little cresty things, both sexes have them. They both choose their mates. They also use vocalization and odors for mates. And I would say that we might want to think about using the term mutual mate choice, because they both select things in each other, okay? And those things might be the same, but they're looking at the same kind of general things. And people often say, well, Darwin, invented the concept of mutual sexual selection. He talks about this stuff very easily. And okay, again, here's a long passage. Maybe suggests in some cases a double process of selection has been carried on. The males have selected the more attractive females, and the latter the more attractive males. This process, however, though it might lead to the modification of both sexes, would not make the one sex different from the other, unless indeed their taste for the beautiful differed. But this is supposition too improbable to be worth considering in the case of any animal except in man. I want to come back to that because that explains the other half of this book. There are, however, many animals sexually resemble each other. They're furnished in ornaments. That would lead us to attribute the issue of sexual selection. In such cases, it may be suggested with more plausibility that there has been a double or mutual process of sexual selection. The more vigorous and precocious females selecting the more attractive and vigorous males, the latter rejecting all except the more attractive females. Okay, so Darwin appears to be endorsing the concept of mutual selection here, right? Make sense? Yes, we're all going to go yes, aren't we? Okay. Let's read on. The next one. But from what we know of the habits of this view is hardly probable. The male is generally eager to pair with anything. It's more probably ornaments common to both sexes were acquired by one sex, generally the male, and then transmitted to the offspring of both sexes. This is their view of genetics. So beautiful. If indeed during a lengthened period the males of any species were greatly to exceed the females in number, then during a lengthened period under different conditions the reverse would occur. A double but not simultaneous process of sexual selection might easily be carried on, by which the two sexes might be rendered widely different. And he believes this actually happens in humans. So for him, he dismissed the idea of mutual sexual selection. So whenever you read people saying that Darwin supported this, if you actually read all of what he wrote rather than an isolated passage, you might get a different view. So then why are human males and females different? Why do they select for different things in each other? Well, if we understand what Darwin understands here, then we can start understanding what he meant and why he thought sexual selection was important in the evolution of humans. What is it that, for example, females would want to select in males? We're going back here to like the primordial humans. I don't mean Arnold, I mean like Conan. Or whatever. Okay, so obviously strength, leadership, fortitude, ability to go out and hunt, to repel rivals and predators and things like that, and to put meat on the table, and fidelity and things like that. But then what do males look for in females? Well, Darwin reasoned that they would look for characteristics that would make females able to manage the hearth and home, rear the children, take care of the material benefits, do gathering and repairs and things around the house, have certain kinds of intelligences about handling domestic affairs. Oh, I'm sorry. Only one of these people can be president. Okay? So, when we think about things that differentiate males and females, Darwin was thinking about this pattern of logic. We are different from other animals. And remember, when he's writing, the chimp is barely known, never observed in the wild. The gorilla is known, never observed in the wild. Darwin observes a chimp in the London Zoo. Owen had dissected both animals. They knew about monkeys. They knew better the apes from Indonesia. But they did not know the African apes very well, even though Darwin understood that humans must have come out of Africa, partly by proximity to the apes that he did know. So the differences between the sexes for Darwin are growing out of difference in the ways that males and females cooperate, differences in the kinds of intelligence. He does not think females are dumber than males or vice versa. He thinks they have different kinds of intelligence. He thinks they behave in different ways. And this is why, from all the intelligence he gathers in his 5 years on the Beagle and all the anthropological writings that he wrote about people traveling, he was seeing the same patterns over and over again, with very few exceptions. So the division of labor for him becomes critical, because that is what enables humans essentially to multitask as a group. For them to be altruistic and to cooperate in a group, it separates them from the other animals that they know about. And he reasons that this is the dawn of essentially a proto-civilization, by giving us not just social groups, but functioning cooperative groups in which different individuals have different roles. And that's why the males and females selected traits in each other that are different. It's the only species he knows to do so. And he understands something that maybe you've never thought of. That is that the secondary sexual characteristics of males and females evolved before the differences that characterize different human populations with superficial characteristics of skin color, hair color, things like that. And he understands that there are kind of these universals in structures and behavior that distinguish and characterize males and females throughout most human populations. Many of you understand about social selection, and is sexual selection part of social selection. Tobias and their colleagues argued that probably it is, and I would agree that sexual selection is a subset of social selection, because social selection encompasses basically all of the actions of individuals in a group that promotes their general welfare. And then you have Landon Montgomery talking about that Darwin's distinction has been useful, but recent confusion suggests some traits are not easily characterized as naturally or sexually selected. I just put this to say, yes, there's recent confusion. He was not confused. He was not confused, but people have become confused, I think, as a result of the historical chain that we've talked about here. And he knew, Darwin knew and said over and over in his big book that some traits are not easily characterized as naturally sexually, and they could be, in fact, in some cases, shaped by both processes. This is the hierarchy I want to talk about here, because all of these terms are used frequently in the literature. I think species recognition is not nearly given enough attention by biologists, and they admit it when you see reviews of species recognition in the literature, and they're very, very good reviews. What strikes me is that when they do reviews of species recognition, it's usually during mating season. So recognizing your species and figuring out who you want to mate with, those effects are difficult to separate. But I think everyone agrees you have to be able to recognize who's in your species before you do any of these other things. Social selection encompasses all the things once you've recognized who's in your species, all the interactions you have with them. You know, common bonding, taking care of each other, sounding alarms against predators, and so forth. Now we get down to a subset of social selection, which is all about mating. First of all, you have to recognize who is appropriate to mate with, unless you're a dog and you don't care. And then after that, you usually have to make a choice of mates, if there is a choice. Sometimes the choices are limited, and so there is competition for mates. And among that whole subset of mate competition, when one sex has a structure or behavior that the other sex doesn't, and that sex uses it to attract mates or repel rivals, then you have sexual selection. It's a small corner of these greater interactions, although it's extremely widespread and phylogenetically hugely bound in the animal kingdom. It's still conceptually a subset of these other concepts that were so familiar to us. And so we find these things in a lot of different animals, the structures and behaviors that we want to look at. And we want to wonder, when you see these bizarre structures in other animals, what can you say about them? And I'm going to run through this quickly because I know you're not paleontologists, but I know everybody likes dinosaurs. Right? And I want to show you how the current condition of literature in the neontological world has informed what a lot of paleontologists today are thinking about when they're trying to interpret the structures of these things. In general, for old dead critters, when you're trying to figure out what a bizarre structure and it's not a member of a clearly living group, like we're pretty sure we know what, extinct antelope horns, that's okay. But when you're talking about a critter like this, I mean, whoa, the sky's the limit. And it has been in terms of producing hypotheses. Generally speaking, traditionally paleontologists have gone first for mechanical explanations, things that bear on some kind of function, and they've tried to test it to some degree or another. If those mechanical explanations don't seem to work very well, or they don't even bother, they just say it's for display. Well, there's lots of different kinds of display here that often are not very well dissected in the literature. These, oh, must be for display. Okay, that's a starting point, but can we test hypotheses beyond this? Well, many of you know about Dave Weisample's experiments and studies of Parasaurolophus, which is a duck-billed dinosaur, a crested duck-billed dinosaur from the late Cretaceous. And here's, the blue is the nasal passages. He breathes up here. It goes back down like this. There's a diverticulum here. And then it goes back down into the lungs from this direction. There were myriad hypotheses proposed over the years of what this crest could have been used for. and I'm giving you just a bunch of them here. Dave's first approach was to see whether these were testable. Because if it's not testable, it may be interesting, but we can't do anything about it. There are many reasons why he had problems with it, but the cool thing he did was to take a bunch of PVC tubing of the same size as this and build what he called a hydrophone. And because he made a honking noise through it, and it actually made, it resonated at particular frequencies. And I've given to you here, that's kind of sort of a chord like thing. But you know how it is, you sing in the shower and you kind of, something's, right, so you've all done this. and then he said, well, this isn't enough. He checked the size of the stapes, which tells you the frequencies that they can hear, and they matched. So that's good. And recently, Sarah Werning and Andy Farkey and some other people found a baby of Parasaurolophus. And the first thing he did, one of the things he did was to check the stapes. And it turns out the babies can also hear these frequencies, which is cool because they're smaller. Parasaurolophus is 30 feet long. The baby like this, but he can still hear what the adults are capable of producing. So I don't know what that means, but at least it shows it's not inconsistent with the general hypothesis. But the problem we get is when we move to related animals, what happens? And here's where the advent of phylogenetics really helps us to put a control, some kind of control on our hypotheses about what old dead things were doing. These guys are all related, but they have completely different crests that would not have functioned in the way that the crest of Parasaurolophus was suggested by Y-sample to function. What if you look at Triceratops? Here's Andy Farkey. So he took some of these toy dinosaurs from the British Museum and just said, well, if they play Sir Lancelot, where's the places where they're going to get their heads most beat up? And so he graphed those on the bones. This is where he expected to find them. Then he went to real skulls in museums and said, does it correlate with this? Turns out not very well. Not very well. What he didn't ask is whether some skulls had a lot of it and some skulls didn't, because maybe you'd have a male-female difference there. But you know what? We can't tell the males from the females in these sequences. The great variety of the horns and frills, most of which, by the way, in almost all animals except Triceratops over here, are actually open. So if you think this evolved for use as a shield, you'd be mistaken. Triceratops is the end member in time and phylogeny of its group. And for most of its existence, genetically, it doesn't have an open frill. So you can't transfer, even if you think Sir Lancelot was what they're doing, you can't translate that to the other kinds of critters in these lineages. It gets no better when you try to do it on a phylogeny. Can you see any progression in the shapes of these horns and bells and whistles and holes? They're just different. They're held together by some characteristics, but really, they just look different. You go to the other branch of the ceratopsians, and the same thing happens. It's really very hard to find any kind of pattern that would sort itself out in terms of I'm getting better adapted, or I'm making this because it looks sexier when it gets bigger. You don't see it. You just find them to be different from each other. The same is true of stegosaurs, and I won't bore you with this. And yet we have people who tell us that crests and horns probably function as sexually select. So how do they test this? The answer is they don't, because they say there's no single reliable means of recognizing sexual selection. But didn't Darwin have one? Can we tell the males and females apart? If we could, wouldn't we come up with something like that? But they say now there are several cases where sexual selection is strongly supported. And they give you this figure and invite you to conclude that these structures arose through sexual selection. But there's no male-female differences that are even demonstrated in these animals. They say this is the case for a pterosaur, but there's many reasons why it doesn't work and why they didn't consider other hypotheses. The same thing is true for Pteranodon with its crest. They say these might be males and females, but they're just saying it. And there's lots of variation here. Here's Confucius ornis, some of which specimens have those two long tail feathers and some which don't. But as Chiappi and Earl pointed out when they describe these animals, monograph them, there's no pattern. There's nothing else that links it to that you can say as males and females, not size or anything else. Peter Dodson's study of Protoceratops thought he found male-female dimorphism, but there's just slight statistical differences. And the problem is he seems to have regressed size on relative size related characters, which you kind of can't do. So that work has to be redone. Even so, they were just very small. Tom Lehman thought there was sexual dimorphism in these horn cores of Triceratops, but the fact is that when John Scannella and Jack Horner got a complete growth series, they realized that what happens is that during growth, and these actually 3 of these skulls are in the library. If you want to go see them for yourself. That the little babies start out with the trainer horns and the little scallopy frill that goes down the back. Then it curves upwards. The horns start going straight up, and then when they get to a certain size, the horns start to reform and point forward like this. Okay, and the frill becomes longer, and actually in the end it opens up a bit and becomes Torosaurus, which we thought was a completely different thing, but it turns out to be just an adult Triceratops by their reasoning. So all of these things show a reformation of your head shape during growth. Who does that? And yet, we can't tell the males from females. If they can do this, they surely could have shown us which the males and females are. Mark Goodwin and Jack found a similar example for the dome-head dinosaurs or pachycephalosaurs, that 3 different genera turn out to be just developmental stages of one dinosaur. But they modify their skulls through life. This is nuts. But again, if they can do this, why can't they indicate to us who the males and the females are? Well, actually, by looking at bone histology, this is why we do this. Because we have an independent, by cutting up the bones, we have an independent assessment of how old these things are. And where sometimes people are saying they're males and females, they seem to be simply just animals of different ages. You will find literature that says gracile and robust members of a species, and they've often been called males and females, but they're likely ontogenetic stages, and here's why. When you grow, like these elephants here, so the male and female elephants, right? Actually, no, it's not. What are they? They're both male. They're both females. They're just young, but okay. So I just did that. And femora, bony, bones can show some differences like this. Why are they showing these differences? It has to do what happens when you age. I don't want to break this to you. And it's not about the freshman 15. It's a different thing. But you do stop getting taller because your bones get to a certain linear growth, but you continue to accumulate mass even in your bones. And the way you do this is by ossifying and calcifying things that were cartilaginous before and tendinous. So when you take all those trochanters and you start making them, making them bony rather than these nice rounded cartilage things, they look really gnarly. And they look gnarly because that's the way your bones grow. When they finish growing, they fuse up and they get all these features on them. Everything has determinate growth, and it grows like this. And things that you think are males and females quite often are just not fully grown. They haven't started to put on the changes in those bones that make that happen. We find this in dinosaurs. Here's Holly Woodward's work. For the same age, you can be of vastly different lengths. You can have a 2-meter difference in your length at the same age, being a duckbill myosaur here. We know that animals stop growing because they deposit this layer of avascular acellular bone at the end of their lives. Then they're not going to grow linearly anymore, but they're still going to put weight on their bones, but slowly. So you're going to stop growing at a certain point. And that's pretty much how this works. So if we want to look at this in extinct animals, which is what really got me on this whole jag in the first place, we want to see dimorphism for Darwin's definition. We have to have a good enough sample. We have to have an independent assessment of age, otherwise you're just saying stuff. And we've got to test alternate hypotheses, like they could be just parts of an ontogenetic series or populational variation of a different sort. So the hierarchy that I showed you before works for me in a certain way because we think actually that most of these bizarre structures in the critters we're seeing in the extinct world evolved as a result of species recognition because we can't tell males from females. And in those crazy clades of dinosaurs I showed you, if you have sexual or natural selection, you would expect them to diverge in fairly regular ways because you would have features that improving them would be good for you. But if species recognition, if your only objective is to be different, then you can go off into whatever directions you want, and your phylogenetic pattern will be kind of crazy. This is oversimplifying it a bit, but I think it's one test of whether a form of selection is really at work or whether what you're looking at is a species recognition. And that's what, because divergence and diversity for itself can often be good for its own sake. So here's three very closely related antelope with different shaped horns, straight, curved, or spiral, different coat colors. These things are probably signaling different things, but it's very hard for us to say that they have a functional thing. They are related to sexual selection in these animals and likely to species recognition as well. So bizarre structures, we kind of think species recognition often works better. I don't want to use it as a default, but I think you have to test it in clades to see whether you can do it. And I don't like the idea that if other explanations aren't working so well, this default one must be right. That's not a logically good. You've got to have evidence for it. But I think there are some tests that we can apply. I'm happy to talk to you about it later. So if we restrict sexual selection to Darwin's view, I think we get less confusion. And that really helps, I think, in the long run. And I want to thank all these people, and particularly all you guys for listening to all this nonsense today. I'm happy to stay up and talk to you. Thanks a bunch.